It's story time. Chapter 4. The Lonely Girl. Visiting your parents can have its stressful moments, even more so if their home is haunted by a restless spirit. This is my friend. We'll call him Dan.
Growing up, I was really interested in the paranormal. And, so as a teenager, I do remember one time a friend of mine and I getting out on a Ouija board and in my basement trying to, talk to ghosts. And weirdly enough, in our session, my bass guitar that was downstairs strummed. And that was enough. And I threw the Ouija board away and never touched it again and was not interested anymore because it scared the out of me. So flash forward many years, I now live on my own, married, and decided to take my wife back to my parents' home for Christmas one year. My wife is sensitive to things. She can feel things. She kind of has a sixth sense about a lot of stuff. So we go home for Christmas. And my aunt is also very in tune with that sort of thing. She can see auras. I don't know if it was having the two of them in the house together or what, but everyone was there. We were put upstairs in the top floor, which is where when I lived there, I used to live in that room when I was a teenager. But so we go upstairs and it's kind of hard to describe, but basically if you go up the stairs, you get to a landing point and the wall is in front of you. So you have to turn to your left and then it opens up into the second floor. There's like a pony wall that goes along where the stairs go down, and then it shoots all the way back to the back wall, and then there's like a little alcove straight across from where the beds are. I hope that makes sense. So my wife and I go to bed. We're laying in bed and we're facing the alcove. The stairs are all the way across the room on the left side. And we're laying there and start to drift off to sleep, and she's laying on my chest. And that place like right between being awake and being asleep, or just kind of starting to drift like right into sleep. That's kind of where I felt like I was. And right at that point, I heard what sounded like someone running from the landing at the top of the stairs all the way over to the bed. And then I felt something grab my foot and I jerked. And as soon as I jerked, my wife jerked too. And I just laid there. I didn't know if I was dreaming or what. So I didn't say anything. And she says, "Did you hear that?" And I didn't want to feed into anything. I wanted to hear what she was talking about. So I was like, "Hear what?" And she said, "It sounded like somebody was running across the floor." And then I felt someone grab my foot. And I was like, "Okay, yeah." And that just happened to me too. And she's like, "What the hell?" And I'm like, "I don't know." So I sit up, I turn the lights on. I'm thinking maybe it's the cat. Maybe it's my younger brother screwing with us. I don't know. So I'm like checking under the bed. I'm looking around. There's no cat. I go to check the door up to the second floor. It's closed. So I'm like, okay, it can't be an animal because the cats are downstairs. So I don't know what the hell it is. So I was like, well, let me go see if my brother's awake and maybe he's screwing with us. So I go downstairs and I open the door and it's probably like 2 a.m. or something. And my brother is sitting in his underwear watching TV, eating pizza rolls. And I was like, "Hey, were you just screwing with us upstairs?" And he's like, "No." He's like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "No." I'm like, "Come on, seriously." And he's like, "No, man, I'm just watching TV." And he's like, "Why?" And I'm like, well, and so I tell him what happens, and he kind of gets this look on his face like, "Oh." And I'm like, "What?" And he's like, "Well, I don't know. I wasn't really going to tell you guys. I didn't want to freak you guys out." And I'm like, "Well, what?" And he's like, "Well, you got to promise not to tell your wife." And I'm like, "All right, well, just tell me." And he's like, "Since you moved, Mom and I have been having really weird stuff happen here." And I'm like, "Okay, like what?" And he's like, "Well, Mom sometimes feels like someone tugging on the corner of her shirt. She's seen lights in her room. My friends have seen in the downstairs basement, in the reflection of the mirror, a little girl standing in the shower. I've felt things in my room." And I'm like, "Wait a minute, what the hell are you talking about?" And he's like, I'm like, you're screwing with me right now." He's like, "No, I'm dead serious." And I'm like, "Well, none of that happened while I was here." He's like, "I know." He's like, "As soon as you moved, like, it started happening around there." I was like 21, 22. I was 22 when I moved. And I'm, at this point, 35. So this has been going on how many years? And he has never told me about it. I'm like, okay, cool. Now I have to go back up there and go to sleep. So I go back up and she's like, "Was it," my wife's like, "Was it him?" And I'm like, "No." But he just kind of told me some stuff, and she's like, what? And I'm like, well, you made me promise I wasn't gonna tell you. She's like, you gotta tell me. And I'm like, all right, okay. So I explain, and she's like, oh my God. And I'm like, I know, right? And I'm like, okay, well, all right, well, let's go to sleep, So we lay back down, same thing, like right before you're falling to sleep, that kind of in-between space, right next to my head is the wall. There's no headboard on this bed, there's this wall. And it sounded like someone took their open palm and smacked 3 times, boom, 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 really hard, like right next to my head. And I sat straight up in bed and I yelled, leave us alone, because it scared the shit out of me. And my wife starts crying. I mean, it was terrifying. It was like the very loud, like a boom almost. And so we turned the TV on and turned the lights on, and we literally laid in bed until the sun came up. And so we go down the next morning, and this is, again, our first night. We're all at breakfast. My grandfather, my grandma, my aunt, my mom, my brother. And I tell this story, and my mom kind of looks a little concerned, but my grandpa just starts cracking up. And I'm like, what's so funny, Grandpa? And he's like, I mean, it's not funny, but the funny part is you got to stay up there another 5 nights. And I was like, oh, cool, that's great. But so my mom had this look on her face, and so I kind of didn't want to bring it up at breakfast. Obviously, it'd be a weirdo. So I waited, and I asked her later. I'm like, what was that? And she's like, well, there's a couple things. She's like, after you moved out, my friend and I had a psychic come over here, and she said that there was a little girl that was here and that was attached to you and me, and because you left, it's like restless. And this home that I grew up in, my mom also grew up in, and they were only the second family to live in this home. The family that lived before them was a father, a mother, and a young teenage daughter. And so when my family moved into the home, my mom and grandma were out in the backyard digging up the garden, and they found this like box, I guess is the best way to describe it, like a small little box, and they opened it up, and there was a jar inside that had like liquidy, gross looking stuff. And so my mom was like, I think that maybe this unwed teenage girl maybe got pregnant, and they terminated the pregnancy and they buried it in the backyard. And because, it's like the 50s, and that's like a no-no, and I guess I could see that happening, but it was just such a weird thing to hear. So yeah. And in fact, my wife always says, like, you got to stop talking about it when you're there, because you're riling it up, and you guys acknowledging it is making it more powerful and be able to do more stuff. So I just try to not think about it now, and I just can't ever sleep when I stay at my mom's house now.
Every haunted house story needs an origin. A buried jar with a mystery substance provides just enough information to validate the paranormal activity while also leaving the story open for interpretation. Did the jar really contain the remnants of a terminated pregnancy, or, as I think is more likely, a miscarriage? It's impossible to know. But the activity within the home implies a lonely spirit. Perhaps this girl had grown attached to Dan over the years. He was very young when his family moved into this house. He never saw this girl as a kid, and there weren't any blatant paranormal occurrences, probably because she was happy and content with Dan there. So once he moved out, she might have become agitated and demanded to know where her friend had gone. And then, for him to finally return years later with his new wife, I can imagine that must have been upsetting for her. When people speak of their haunted houses, they're usually the victim, too scared to fall asleep, terrorized in their own home. To this day, Dan's mom and brother still experience strange things. But it's not as often that we consider the spirit's perspective. This little girl is trapped in an endless loop of longing for a young boy who she will never see again. That girl's spirit might still be in that home long after Dan's parents have left. So in that sense, whose home is it really? Who is intruding on whose territory? Thanks for joining me today. If you like what you heard and would like to support this independently run show, consider becoming a member of my Patreon. Visit patreon.com/storieswithsapphire to see the different tiers and perks like live watch parties or private tarot readings. Have you ever had a stranger in your home? Email me at storieswithsapphire@gmail.com. Salamat and good night. Stories with Sapphire is created and produced by me, Sapphire Sandalo. Special thanks to my guests, Becky Garcia and Sherry Passell. Music written by Sapphire Sandalo. For more information on this episode and my guests, visit storieswithsapphire.com.